For many, growing up is bland. They wish they had a more interesting childhood. Those people do not know how lucky they have it. Jeanette Wall's childhood was one letdown after another. She had no role models, and it was a miracle she came out alive. Being raised properly is a privilege that every child deserves, but not one that every child receives. In the 1960s and 70s, times were much different, but changing rapidly into the time we live in today. The role women have in our society is completely different. Different things were expected of women. They had more limitations. For Jeanette, all the female role models in her life were less than admirable. They followed harmful stereotypes and did little to push for change. The Glass Castle is a memoir by Jeanette Wall, so she did not express her view on feminism by making up characters that reflect her ideas, but rather by her reactions to real-life events that happened to her as a child. As a child, Jeanette grew up with no helpful role models. Even the women most close to her were less than praiseworthy. Jeanette's mother, Rosemary, was selfish, careless, and weak. Not a good role model for someone who wants to grow up to be successful. When Jeanette was young and hungry, she found her mother eating a chocolate bar and hiding it from her own kids. She tried to justify herself by saying they should forgive her the same way they forgive her dad for drinking. She would also let her kids leave the house at young ages for whole days at a time while she was making art. One day, when Jeanette was left alone by her mother, she was raped. Rosemary would often cry in frustration over trivial things. She is mocked by her children and walked all over by her husband Rex. Jeanette wrote her mother as a crummy person. She has made amends with her now, but clearly she hasn't forgotten what her mother did to her. The next most prominent woman Jeanette knew was her dad's mom, Irma, who molested her brother and almost tore the family apart. Not that they were too close to begin with anyways. The only decent woman in Jeanette's childhood was her other grandmother, who they rarely saw because Rex was the head of the family at the time and he hated her. Despite the lack of good, strong women in Jeanette's life, she never blamed women or believed they were all inherently weak. She believed that all the women she met were lousy, but she had some reason to believe that some women could be good because she adored her sisters. Also, I don't think she believed women were worse than men because although she had no good female role models, there were no good male role models as well. All the women in her story in Jeanette's memoir have typical jobs of the time period. Women were thought as housekeepers and had jobs to fit. In one particular home the Walls stayed at was near a strip club / prostitution ring called the Green Lantern. It is interesting that Jeanette included this into her story as it is vulgar. However, it pushes her narrative that life was bizarre and that her life was bizarre and brutal. Also, she may have included it to show how terrible her dad was as he frequented the club. She also may have included it to show how bad all the women were in her childhood and her view of a woman at the time. All women in Jeanette's childhood had negative effects on her life. Some were viewed as sex objects, others were terrible people. Her mother was mainly a housekeeper that neglected her kids to pursue art. It seemed like almost all of the people in Jeanette's childhood are terrible. Women were also treated terrible in the book. Jeanette was taken advantage of twice, once while her dad was watching. Rosemary was almost run over by Rex. They also didn't have much of a voice. Women also didn't have much of a voice in the book. Rosemary would let Rex control her life because he was a male. I think that the treatment of women in this book was because of the place Jeanette and her family lived in. Most of the places they lived in were very poor, and may have been a reason why all the women were treated even worse than regular women were at the time period. I believe that if Jeanette lived in a nicer place, then there would be less prostitutes and woman abuse. The women in the story were treated like second-class citizens. Jeanette would watch on multiple occasions as her dad would come home drunk and beat their mom. We heard heavy, uneven footsteps at the front door. We turned and saw Dad. He tripped on the coffee table. When we tried to help him, he cursed and lurched at us, swinging his fist. Jeanette's grandmother tried to get the kids to live with her in her nice house so they wouldn't be hungry. When Rex decides the family should leave the grandmother's house, the grandmother asked Rosemary to make the kids stay, but she said she can't because Rex was the head of the family just because he was a male. Women in the Glass Castle are weak and very limited to their job choice in life. I do not believe this is what Jeanette Wall thinks of women. However, she wrote the female characters based off what she thought of them when she was a small child. In her childhood, she was only exposed to bad influences, both male and female. In her childhood, women were restricted to certain jobs, and many were abused by men with little repercussions. Also, Jeanette could not believe that all women are weak because she survived many obstacles and was a very strong person herself.